Hi guys, this is Travis, and today is the final video on the Walt Whitman literary discussion, looking at the book by David Reynolds. Today's talk will focus on the 6th and 7th sections, which are sex, gender, comradeship, and then Civil War, Lincoln, and Reconstruction, which really completes the circle, if you will, of information on Whitman and the book and poetry and things like that. So if you have been watching and following along and you've seen the first 3 parts, thank you, and I hope you enjoy this part as well. I hope you've taken some good information from them, and I would definitely like to have comments and discussion in the comment section below if you did. Alright, so during the time period, there's a fresh intensity for love. There's a quote here from Whitman: "In the plentiful feast of romance presented to us, all the novels, all the poems really dish up only one figure, various forms and preparations of only one plot, namely a sickly, scrofulous, crude amorousness." So there's definitely a feeling in literature that there's a sensation, if you'll pardon the pun, in literature going on, like sensational work, or the love story, the plot, the sexuality, free and open sexuality. There's a discussion going on about that. There's a difference between erotic sexuality or erotic behavior and then free progressive thought about sexuality. Whitman tends to praise morality, to praise the body, to praise sexuality for the sake of reproduction. He's not so much into the erotic nature of sexuality. The sensational novel is a genre, or sensational literature is a genre that's gaining momentum at this time period. It's excitement, it's intense love, and it's more the erotic nature that Whitman dislikes. So antebellum sensational fiction combines sex and violence, action, excitement, drama, things like that. And a lot of critics of the time looked at Whitman's literature and thought comparatively that his work is really pure, even when he talks about the body and celebrates it and celebrates sex and reproduction and things like that. Whitman's poetry in this time is a response to this sensational love type literature. His weapon against this erotic, open, exciting love is science, and more specifically science of physiology. So he looks at the way the body works, the way reproduction works, and he sort of uses that to praise that aspect of sexuality. Books about physiology emerge, and they work as a foil to the sensational literature, and Whitman's definitely a student of this type of science. There's a sacredness and a divinity in sex, and Whitman wants to say that sex, in this sense of reproduction and continuing the cycle of life, is the center of existence. That even if he can't believe in the world after, even if he can't believe in any type of higher power, he can still believe in the body, the universe reinventing itself, and people sort of being recycled. He places a special emphasis on motherhood, the womb, phallic imagery, things like that, because they're more so just the beauty of rebirth, or that cycle. So his outlook, therefore, of sex is very religious, but also very scientific and very practical. During the time, there's an artist named Hiram Powers who has a piece called "The Greek Slave." It's a mournful slave woman. It's the most famous American sculpture of the period, and it's an honest portrayal of a nude body and nude image, and it's not sexual in any way. It's more so trying to make a statement. At the time, there is a movement, feminism. Feminism is sort of developing, and the voice of the feminist is becoming prevalent in society. It's interesting that Reynolds takes note of the feminist voice in Whitman's poetry. Women's equality is equal to praise for the body. Whitman feels that when people begin to accept sex and understand sex as a method of reproduction and the divinity of people, and the fact that they can recycle this energy and recycle these parts of the individual's body, that more acceptance for women will soon follow it. There's a bit of a period, a movement called real womanhood, Woman's self-reliant. She's economically stable, and but also maternal and still fully capable of motherhood. Sort of the thing that women praises women for the most, being almost a godlike figure. A woman is the creator of men and women as well, or the one who gives birth to those creatures. And this real womanhood idea is something that's interesting because it sort of combines the idea of the time of domesticity, but it also gives women more opportunity to work and to pursue the things they want to pursue and not simply be a housewife. So Whitman looks at women orators, celebrates them, women who are active in the public and who speak and who do things like that. There's a study in his work about the flawed relationship between sexes, and there's no time to go into it right now, but Whitman's definitely attentive to these things. At the time, there are two sort of extremes: the Shakers, who are all for celibacy, and then the free lovers, who are pursuing the abolishment of marriage in favor of passionate attraction. And the free lovers are sort of looking at marriage as a way to tie down women, to domesticate them. It's almost animalistic language, and so in that pursuit, they praise and celebrate open sexual nature and physical attraction and things like that. Emerson sort of connects Whitman to the free love group, that magnetic attraction in poetry, but at the same time, I feel like, and Reynolds would say that Whitman's work is very much empowering morality and empowering relationships that aren't simply about that initial attraction. The free lovers and the feminists do have similar ideas, but they're not the same. The concept is different, even though they do agree on certain things, particularly the male's control and power in the relationship. Before the Civil War, intimacy between people of the same sex is fairly common. Lover and is sort of a synonym for friend. If you think about the Bible and biblical stories, whenever two males would share a kiss or two males would interact with one another in a way that maybe in today's society we feel is romantic or flirtatious, it wasn't so during that time period, and this holds true for a long time. So when Whitman's language is, sometimes it looks like he's exploring his homoerotic nature. At times he's just talking about comradeship and friendship and not exactly sex. The Civil War, the next big topic or the next big experience, is not something that is expected. Well, it is expected because people know that there's tension in the nation over slavery and other problems, but it wasn't something that was supposed to happen. People weren't supposed to go and kill one another. But Whitman thinks that it was probably necessary. If you think back to Song of Myself and some of the things that Whitman is trying to accomplish, he wants to see this fragmented society unified and people to start addressing problems. And his poetry isn't necessarily enough to inspire this conversation, but the Civil War does. He says of Leaves of Grass, he says, the whole book revolves around that 4 years' war, and drum taps is pivotal to the rest of the book. So if you think back to the beginning with the prelude, Song of Myself, and if you think ahead to the ending and some of the sections, you realize that this huge turning point for the country is this passionate event full of energy, excitement, conversation, zealous action, activity. And it's definitely a catalyst for some of the change that Whitman sees. It pulls together virtually all Americans, people of all professions, walks of life, in this sacrifice, heroic sacrifice. Whitman's brother George, when he's injured, Whitman becomes a nurse, and he goes and spends time with the soldiers, nursing their wounds. He writes about this in his poetry. Sometimes violence is celebrated during the time. Hard certainty is appealing. As I said, all professions are connected through this big event, whether you're on one side or the other. Obviously, the common man, which is a huge part of Whitman's early poetry, is celebrated once again because those are the troop that make up these huge armies predominantly. sees experience firsthand as a nurse in the hospitals. He sees the wounded. He hears their stories. He shares his own stories. More Americans died in this war than all other wars combined, which is absolutely crazy. But through the war, several of Whitman's goals or poetic goals are realized. The common man's validated. The ideal family and the love of comrades are sort of materialized. Indulgence of humanistic magnetic ideas. There's a social cleansing occurring in Washington, which is being flooded by wounded soldiers who are in protest and who are ready for things to be settled. So Whitman says that these soldiers that he spent all this time with and nursing really saved him, but they also saved America. And as a result, there's generosity, tact, propriety, affection, toughness, all in the face of death and destruction. Whitman fixates on the idea of union. Thus, he fixates on Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln to Whitman is next to God. He's absolutely central to a lot of the themes that Whitman's discussing. During his lifetime, he saw Lincoln 20 to 30 times, but they never actually met. He saw him in passing. I think it said that Lincoln made a nod toward him at one point. So what is the fascination? Well, Lincoln seems typical. He has drab looks. He celebrates the common man. He's a rail splitter, a flats boatsman. He's just the hardworking American who is favoring harmony and freeing these people who deserve freedom. Whitman says that Lincoln's the I, the big voice of Leaves of Grass. So when you hear that voice, I think about some of the ideals and some of the things that Lincoln embodies. Whitman says of his death that it's a crucial, transcendent moment in American history. And it's interesting some of the things that Whitman says about religion, because in a way, Lincoln's death is similar to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ in the Bible. And Whitman's definitely familiar with scripture and biblical stories and things like that. So it's interesting that Lincoln is sort of a sacrificial lamb to remove some burden of the people. Following the Civil War's industrialization, new power structures. As a result, Whitman regains faith in the democratic process. He gets peace in his philosophy, his idea about eternity. The Whitman myth sort of comes after. He's fired by James Harlan from the government, and the image of the poet changes, and it goes into this persona as a neglected genius who's spotless in his writings, which to me is incredibly narcissistic, but it's sort of, I guess it's critique of Harlan, and it's also a complaint, but ends up working out in Whitman's favor. He doesn't talk very much about AfricanAmerican suffering. When he does, it seems to be derogatory. There's a bit of racism in his perception of African Americans. It's fueled by ethnological science of the time period, which is people thought that inferior ethnic groups or inferior races would be removed by natural selection. This sort of just part of the fuel for slavery and the reason that Southerners are so passionate about the Civil War and the topic of slavery. He explores the soul's voyage to the next sphere, and ultimately his dreams are sort of realized in his work. So, in reflection, Whitman, it's interesting to think about the idea of Emerson calling for that American voice and that American poet who can really describe the problems of society and who can tackle those problems. And as a poet, and Whitman, I think he succeeds in many ways. I think he succeeds in addressing things. I think he succeeds in pushing people to take a second look at topics like sex and politics. But I'm not sure that Whitman's voice was enough. I think the Civil War is definitely a strong catalyst for a lot of the change that happens. And I think there are other important factions like the feminist group and the feminist voice, civil rights voice and civil rights movement, and different things that are beginning to move at the same time during this period. in America. And I think ultimately the biography does a really nice job of looking at topics in a big and broad context. Does a nice job of commenting on some of Whitman's perspectives, some of Whitman's ideas, and it does a nice job of giving evidence from the poetry. So this week, if you want to look at my blog post, it is about the poem Reconciliation, which is from Drum Taps. And it makes a nice connection to the movie Fight Club, if you like that movie or you haven't seen it or are interested. So I'll put the link in the description box below so you can go find that, and you can check out the other blog post as well. I will continue doing the blog post each week until I move on to Emily Dickinson in the class. But this is the final video that I'll be filming and uploading because I'm finished with the biography. So I don't have any more comments about David Reynold's book. And I appreciate once again the support, and I hope you will pass these videos on to peers, colleagues, friends, whomever you think may be interested. And that's it. I appreciate your time.